Hey, welcome to this programming user interface lecture. Today we're going to continue talking about JavaScript and move on to loading content or working with APIs. So in the previous lecture, the intro to JavaScript, we looked at using JavaScript to manipulate CSS, basically how to locate elements on a page, how to manipulate their CSS, change their class, change their attributes, set their attributes, etc. And so the next kind of step in doing this would be more of not just altering what's there, but actually creating new content or importing new content using an API. So we're going to look at loading content, and basically to do that, we need to talk to an API. And so an API is basically a web server that instead of returning an HTML page, returns data. And so your front end code, your client, your web page can talk to one of these servers and it can send data back. And once it has the data, it can do something with it, right? And so you often see this in websites that don't want to refresh the entire page, right, to make a change, right? So it could talk to a server, get the latest status, and refresh the page. An example of this would be like if you ever use social media site like a Twitter or something like that. You don't have to reload the page to see what's new. It just talks to the server and updates the content with something new. It's doing something very advanced to do all that, but the basic idea is the same. It's talking to a web server. That web server is sending back data, and that's using that data to refresh the interface. So the way that we're going to be doing that is by interacting with the server and building new elements in our page, and that data is sent as JSON. And JSON is just a data serialization format, and so a server is sending that instead of an HTML page, and your JavaScript knows how to parse it. So the first thing we need to do before we start working with APIs is kind of think about what we're going to do with the data once we have it. So in the previous lecture, we talked a little bit about locating elements on the page, right? So there's an existing element on the page. We want to capture it and we want to do something with it, and change the style, add a different class to it, etc. So we didn't really look at creating new elements from scratch, which is something you might want to do if you're talking to a server and you want to recreate an element, or you want to update the refresh display. You want to be creating new elements and that's just not modifying everything that's been there. So we're going to take a quick look at doing this of creating an element. These two things that are still left highlighted. So basically, creating an element in memory and then adding it to our page somehow. And then you could do all sorts of stuff like we did last time, like modified style and attributes, etc. So let's do a quick example of creating an element. So we're going to make a new glitch here. We'll just make a basic static hello world page. And so what we want to do is thinking about what kind of element we want to do, and then what we want to do with it. And so for just a kind of a simple example, let's just create a new script here at the bottom of the page, and we'll create a new element doing that. So we have this is going to be our JavaScript here at the bottom of the page. So we're going to make a new script tag, right? And put our code inside of there. And what we want to do is basically create an element in memory. And when I say element, it could be anything, a div, it could be an image, it could be any sort of HTML element. And so what we're going to do is create a div. For example, let's create a div. And so the way you create it is you start off with a document. And remember, the document's always there. It's like this reserved word. It represents the entire web page. And you simply say create elements, camel case, create element. And so inside of the parentheses, you put what kind of element you want to create. So we're going to create a div element. And if we ran this, we can see, make sure there's no errors in our console, right? So there's no errors. That's just something else. And so now this element, this div, was created in memory, basically. And when I say in memory, it's like not on the page yet, right? It's just in the program, in its memory. But what we want to do is actually now insert it into the page somehow. And so to do that, we need to kind of store its pointer or store its reference to it in a variable. So we're going to say var, how we define our variables, and give it a variable name, right? This can be anything we want. So we'll call it my div. and set it there. And then we can just make sure it worked right. We can console.log it and see how it turns out. Right, so this code is at the bottom of the page, so it just runs as soon as the page loads. And so console log to here, and it just says it's a div element. You created a div element, right? And so if this was something else instead of a div, like a image tag or elements, it'd say, here's your image element, I created it. And you notice when I hover over this, it's not displayed, right? It's not highlighting like if you hover over this thing. It's not in the page yet. So it hasn't been actually added to the page, so it doesn't exist in the page, so it doesn't highlight it for you there. So what we want to do is the next step is to actually add it to the page somewhere. And so the way you can do this is by inserting it into the body of the page, or you can insert it into any kind of sub-element of the body of the page. So if you had a div somewhere. So let's make let's just add it to the body of the page just to begin with. So we have this pointer to my div. So let's create a pointer to the body of the page. So we'll say var page body equals, and now this is going back to what we did last time, a document get element by, and last time we did a lot of get element by ID, but we can actually say get element by tag name. And we'll say body. All right, so now we have my div, and let's console log my body, page body, and see what it looks like. All right, so I spelled something wrong. Probably get element by tag name did not come out right. So get elements by tag name, plural, right? Because there could be multiple elements. And so this is something new too, right? So what it did is, since we're getting elements by, we're saying get elements by tag name, it's basically looking for all the elements on the page that have that specific tag. And so while you would never really have two bodies, it's the way that this is set up is that it's expecting to return multiple things, regardless of if there is only one thing or not. And so what this does is that it returns this list or array of elements as a HTML collection, and you can see that here. And so there's only one thing in it, and so that's at the 0 position, and there's our body. So this would make more sense if we had a bunch of divs on the page, right? So if we already had a whole bunch of divs, and we said, okay, get element by tag name div, and then we're going to console log it. So if we reload it, we'd see, all right, so now this HTML collection now has all of the divs that I found on the page, and they're all represented here in the DOM elements, right? So there's one up there, there's one that holds the glitch button as a div, etc. Right? So these divs are all on the page somewhere. And so this get element tag or get elements by tag name always returns an array of them, even if there's only one of them, like the body. And so the way you talk about when you're working with arrays of things like this HTML collection, you can say what position in the array you want to pick. And so when you have an array like this, we'll say my array. And you have an array of things. And an array can be anything you have. Like it could be these strings, it could be numbers, it could be HTML elements themselves. So if you wanted to reference this first one, it's the first one, but it starts off with 0. So the indexes are based on 0. So this is actually in the 0 position. And then this one would be in the 1 position, this would be in the 2 position, this would be in the 3 position. So if you wanted to log the first thing in the element in this array, you'd say console.log my array, and then you use these square brackets to reference which index position you want to talk about. And so we're talking about the 0 position, and this is the variable here in the 0 position, which is this thing. So if we ran that, we'd see it would console log the first thing in the list, in the element, in the array, which is ASDF, and it's in position 0. Or if we wanted to talk about the next one, we'd say position 1, etc., right? So this get elements by a tag name does the same thing. It returns them as an array. And so you could reference which piece of the array you want to talk about by using these square brackets and the number index position you want to talk about. So if we're talking about these divs, let me add some more content here so they actually show up. So again, we're talking about these HTML collections of divs. There's a bunch of divs on the page. If we wanted to talk about this first one, right, we'd have to say 0 in our code. So we say 0 position, and that would be the first one in the index. So now it's not going to be returning all of them. It's just going to be returning the very first one that is in the array that it was returned. So using these numbers, we can refer to the first one in the array of results. So now let's switch this back from looking for the divs to looking for just the body. And so even though there's only one of them, it's still returning it as an array, so we still need to reference the first one that I found, which is the only one, but it's the body one. It's a position 0. And so to reference the body, we say page body 0, right? Because this is the variable that's returning the array of get elements by tag name, and there is only one thing in the array, right? So the array looks like this, and that's it. There's one thing in there. But since it is still an array, we have to say the 0 position, the first one in there. And so if we run this again, we should get a reference to the body. So it's referring to the entire body. All right, so this whole point of this is to get our pointer, our hook into the DOM somewhere to actually add our element that we just created in the previous lines of code, right? So let's delete these console log stuff. And so now that we have a link or a pointer to the page body, and we have a new div that we just created out of thin air, we can append it to the body or append it to anything we want that we've located, right? And so we're going to say to do this, you always start off with the parent node and then append child and then the node or the element you want to append to it. And so we're going to start off with the parent, which is our page body, and it's in position 0, right, because we returned a bunch of them. And we're going to say append child, and we're going to say what child do you want to append, and we're going to say the variable that stores a pointer to my div, the div that we created in memory. And so if we ran this, it doesn't return any results. We don't need to store the results. It just kind of does it. And there's no errors, but if we looked at the elements in here, we'd see that there should be a new div added here at the bottom of the page, right? So append child, when you think about appending something, it just adds it to the end, right? And so it's appending it to the end of the page. So we can make this a little bit more we can stand it out a little bit more by changing the inner HTML of the div, right? So this div is the same as if we pulled it off a pointer to the page. It's still a div, so it has all those things built into it that still are available to us. Things like inner HTML, things like style left, things like get attribute, set attribute, etc. So we could say my div dot inner HTML equals hello there. And so now it's adding this inner HTML to the element before it's even adding it to the page. And so it appears in our page at the top there. And if we look in the code, it's actually at the very last thing in the body, right? And so then, of course, you could do all sorts of stuff to it, right? After you set the inner HTML, you could say style color equals blue. And it would, be blue. And if you inspected that, you'd see that set the style attribute of the color to blue. So we could do that in a different way. So say we had a div here. So we're going to say div, and we're going to give it an ID. And we're going to say it's going to be my content. All right, so we have this div here. It exists. And so we're going to still create a new div called my div, and that's set the color blue. And we're going to say we'll say change the text here to say this is new div. And so we're gonna not add it to the page of the body though. We're gonna add it just to that specific piece of the div, the my content div that we created. And so this type, in this case, we need to get a pointer to that div, but we're not gonna use the get elements by tag name because it's a div. We don't want to turn all the divs. We're gonna use the other get element by, we're gonna say get element by ID. So we'll say my content var my content equals document dot get element by ID, right? And we'll say, okay, what's the ID that you want to use? And it's going to be this one, the my content ID that we're using up there. And so now this my content, which is just a variable, right? It could be anything, has a pointer to the div that's in the web page. And then we can just simply do the same thing. We'll say append child, and then what do you want to append? My div that I created in memory. And so if we look at that again, it's the same idea. There's a new div, and if we came in here and we could see that here's the my content div, and it added that new div we created in memory only to that existing div, right? So it's the same idea of adding it to the page, but this time you're actually just finding a specific thing in the place on the page you want to add it, and then inserting it into the data. So this is kind of the same process that we're going to do for working with APIs. You're going to basically talk to an API. You're going to receive the data the API has to offer, and it's going to be in this JSON format, which is a data serialization format. And then we're going to do something with it, right? So we're going to create a new element. We're going to alter existing elements on what we just did in this example of creating a new div in the page. So to do this, we need to know a couple things on how to actually talk to APIs. And so there's two points to this one. First is talking to the API from the JavaScript. And then the second thing is also like just what is an API and what is it going to return. So I put a link into the slides, but here's like a list of some very simple public APIs that people have aggregated. And so like, let's like look at an extremely simple version of an API. So they have like an animal API and they have like a dog API. And so basically this API, this is the API endpoint. And again, an API endpoint is just it's just a server on the internet that's returning JSON instead of returning a web page, instead of returning HTML. So if you actually took this URL and you put it into your browser and you went to that address, it would return the data for that API. And so you can see this returned this data element, right? These curly brackets and these key values, instead of returning a web page. There's no web page behind this. This is not a web page displaying this. This is the thing itself, right? There's no like web page representing this. This is the data. And so what we can do is look at this JSON data. So this is what JSON data looks like. There's a key and then there's a value. And basically this API, the way it works is that if you go to this URL, it will return JSON that is a random URL to an image of a dog. And so of course there's many other APIs that kind of do all sorts of different things, right? So if you went back to the Studio Ghibli API, let's look at what that does. So this basically says there is a number of API endpoints and they all do different stuff. And so there is a films endpoint. And so if you went to this films endpoint, it would return an array of the films, of Studio Ghibli films, right? And so say 200, an array of films. There is another endpoint where you can give it a specific film ID, right? So if you went to this address and you gave it a specific ID of a film, it would return this JSON data about that film with these key value pairs. There's a people endpoint, right? So you can get a list of people who are involved. And so these look like these are characters in the movies. And you could, same ID, you can give it a specific ID number and it will return data about it. And the same idea with, location, species, and vehicles. These are all just web addresses basically that you pass a certain parameter and it will return data back to you as JSON instead of a web page. And so there's various kind of aspects to working with APIs that you have to be aware of is that, of course, if you're going to be working with an API that's open, then it's no problem, right? Like this very simple dog API. It's so simple that it doesn't care if anyone in the world uses it. It just will just keep working regardless of what. But if you look at some of these other APIs, there is a kind of a column here where it says like, do they have authentication requirements? And so the authentication requirements is, unlike the dog API, do you need to authenticate yourself for you to have access to that API? The same idea how if you went to a web page, you log into it, right? The same idea. You have to log into this API so that it would know who's working with it, and so it can send you data. And they do that for all sorts of reasons, to prevent anybody from using it, right? If you have an open API to the entire world, everyone might want to use it, and you could quickly overwhelm your server. But if you require an API key, so authentication, then it reduces the number of people that could just use it, and you have more control about who has access to it and stuff like that. This other column here is HTTPS, right? And so we talked a little bit about this in the very beginning of the course about how there's different types of data is transferred over the internet in different ways. And this just means it's using secure socket layer, or if in the URL you see HTTPS. So just how web pages can be secure, the APIs can be secure too. And then this last one, cores, is a little tricky to kind of understand, but there was basically it's an attempt to prevent hacking. And so you can imagine if you made a web page and that web page talked to another web page and pulled in data into it, there's like an open area vector of attack there, right? So this web page could talk to another web page and inject code into the current web page and do something bad, right? And so basically, this idea of cores is that it's going to prevent the sort of cross-site talking. So basically, for your code to talk to another site, that other site has to say yes, anyone can talk to this site, or I give permission to this certain domain to talk to this site. So basically, it's just a way to prevent these cross-site kind of vulnerabilities. And so if you're going to use an API, and you're going to use it from your JavaScript from the client side, then it has to have this cores enabled for it to work. And most sites kind of do have that nowadays. All right, so let's give an example with this. So kind of now that we have a feeling of what these APIs are, we now need a way of interacting with them, right? And so to do this, there's some built-in ways of doing it in JavaScript. And one of the latest ones is this fetch method or fetch function that's built into JavaScript nowadays. And so this is a fairly new thing built into JavaScript. It's designed to make working with APIs and other endpoints, web endpoints, very easy. And so basically you just kind of tell what URL you want to use, and then you string together these bunch of kind of then statements. So it's kind of, you can imagine it kind of like flowing through these different steps. And if you can imagine, this would be important because you have to kind of control the flow of the program, because if you think about working with the web, everything's asynchronous, right? So you're talking to a website and then something else might be going on in your other code. And so you have to be really careful about how the flow of the code and the execution works for example, you don't try to access the data before it's actually back from the server with the results, right? So fetch makes this really super easy to do. And the only caveat I would add about this is that if you're going to use a feature, you might want to make sure that it's very well supported across different browsers you might be intending to support. And so, as I mentioned, this is a newer thing. So you might want to go to like a website like this where it's like caniuse.com, and it basically has a list of different web features like CSS properties, JavaScript functions, etc. And you put it in there. And so here's the fetch page, and it's saying the green, right, is of course things that are supported, And so it's been on, um, say, Google Chrome. It's been supported since the 42nd version of it, right? And so that was released back in 2015. So for anyone using Chrome, Fetch would be work fine. Similar for Firefox, for Safari, right? It's been supported for a long time, many years, and you look at this. So even Microsoft Edge, it's been supported since 2016. So, but if you were, say, building a web page that you know for sure had to be supported by support a Internet Explorer client browser, then you probably wouldn't want to use this, right? Because you can see even Internet Explorer 11 does not support this JavaScript function. And so I wouldn't worry too much about this unless you knew specifically you were going to be supporting Internet Explorer 11 users, because there's not really many of them left. This came out almost a decade ago. So even then, it says the global usage is 1%, right? So if you were going to do a project that you're talking to a client, they're like, yeah, this is a little tool you're building that's going to be run inside of our company, and everyone only has Internet Explorer 11. You say, oh, okay, yeah, well, I'm not going to use Fetch then because it doesn't support it. I'd have to figure out a different way of using it. But for us, we're pretty good in the green here. Modern browsers, even old modern browsers, support this, so we can go ahead and use it in our code. And so what we need to do now that we have this way of interacting with code, right, or interacting with the API using this fetch method, we can now think about what we want to do. And so we're going to do something very simple and very straightforward. So that really easy API we saw on the list was this dogs API. So let's do something with that. And so basically, this API, if you hit this API endpoint, it will return a random URL to a image of a dog, right? So it's not returning the image itself, it's returning metadata about an image. So it only has two values, two keys here. It has message and status. And so the status is if the API request was successful or not. And so I'd imagine it would always say successful. And then the message key value is the URL to the dog image, right? So it's not returning the image itself, it's returning a URL you could go to get access to that image. All right, so first things first is like, let's write some code that actually talks to this API and returns the JSON data. So if we go back and use our template that we had set up, let's get rid of all this content stuff we were doing. So now we're back to kind of like an empty um, glitch page. We still have this ID div with my content, and then we have our empty script tag again. So the first things first is like, let's try to talk to this API, right? And so the template I gave you to talk to an API is you say fetch, and inside of these parentheses you say the URL that you want it to fetch. And so we know the URL that we want to fetch is from this API endpoint, and it is this, right? So if you were doing the Studio Ghibli API, you'd have to go find out, /films, what's the whole base of it, the base URL, /films, slash whatever, right? And so for this one, this is the API endpoint. Here's the website, and then here's the kind of the path to get to that specific piece of data. So this is the next thing is a little bit newer grammar for us for code. So when you have something like this in JavaScript, you can actually string together multiple actions together. It's kind of like you're trying to like basically passing the value of the action kind of to the next function you want to do it on, or method you want to do it on. So we can kind of demonstrate this idea of why the syntax is going to look the way it does. So say we have a string here. So we'll say var my string equals hello. And so if we say my string, that's the value of it, right? It's stored and it's set to the word hello. And so what you can do is that these things in JavaScript, these strings have these methods built into them. And so you could say my string dot to uppercase. And so basically that will take the value of the variable if it's a string, and apply this method to it or this function to it, and it'll return it as uppercase, right? And so what you can do is actually you can string these things together, these functions, or we call them methods. And so you could say my string to uppercase, and then you could say some use another one of the other string methods built into it. So you could say pad start. And so basically, pad start says, well, how big do you want the string? And then you can pad spaces at the beginning of it. So say I want the string now to be 10 um, characters long, and I want to pad it with spaces in the beginning. And so there you can see the result. It returned the result of both of those operations, right? So first thing it did was it converted to uppercase, and then it added the padding to the beginning of the string. Um, so JavaScript has a lot of these built-in methods for strings, at least. Another one would be say we could say my string, and we could say okay to uppercase again, and that's uppercase. And then I know strings also have a built-in method called splice or slice that returns a piece of it. So you could say slice start at the 0 position and then go to the 3rd position, and it would return this piece of it, right? So then you could go combine these together to say like, okay, first splice the string out and then apply the uppercase to just that result, and it would combine those two things together. So you're kind of like connecting these things and passing one value onto the next to do this next operation. You're like piping the data between these methods to do its own little action to them and keep going. So this is the same idea for this fetch command, because you can pass it the URL, and then you can say, okay, then do this to the result, and then do that to the result, et cetera, et cetera. So if we have this first step where we're requesting it, we can actually say, okay, once you've made that request, then I want you to do this action to it, and then I want you to do this next action to it. And inside these parentheses is where you put what you want it to do, or what action you want it to do. And so basically we're going to say, okay, for the first action, I want you to take the response and I want you to convert it into JSON. And so these are things that are just built into the fetch request, the thing that it returns. And so this .json basically just takes the results, whatever came back from the API, and tries to turn it into a JSON for you to work with it. And then you can say, okay, then once you do that, right, it's going to pass the result of this operation into the next thing. And you say, okay, then I want you to pass it into my own function. I'm going to pass the response. And then inside of my own function, I want you to do something to that data. So now you have access to the data in this little bracket, in this little function that you just wrote here. And so the only thing we're going to do is console log the response and see what it looks like. And then the last thing you can do is you can add this thing called catch, which basically is a function that you can define that if something goes wrong along the ways, do this thing in case if something happens. So let's say alert, something bad happened. So not very useful for the program, but at least we see if something happened in the request. All right, so make the request to endpoint, turn the request into JSON, then do my own little function to it where I'm just logging it at this point, and then if something happens, let us know. All right, let's see if it works. If we refresh, we can see that it's doing something, right? We can see that it's actually returning results because it's console logging stuff to our console. And if you looked at the network tab, you could see that the network tab shows all the requests that have been made, right? And there's different categories for them. And so there's the all category. And another category is the XHR category, and this shows all the requests that were made after the page was loaded, so these JavaScript requests. And so you can see that it made this request to API, and then let's see if we can find, let's make this smaller. Let's see if we can find it making the request to this endpoint here. And so then we can see, if we go back to the XHR, we can see here's the request made to this random dog endpoint, right? And so it's not there until the page loads, and then it makes this request, and then it returns. You can see the result it returns and inspect it. So we know the request is being done because we can see it in the network tab being created, and we can see it in our actual console because we're logging the results, right? So if we had the wrong URL, for example, in here, so we change this from random with an M to an N. Let's see what it does. All right, so it still made the request, but it returned this instead. It returned an error message as our result. And it says something like, no route found for that. And so that's the actual, it returned JSON saying, oh, there was an error for that request. And then, so that's kind of like an error within their application, right? That error happened within their program, their random dog program to return an error. But say we change something really wrong with it. Say we change the domain to dog with an E, Dodge, and we try to run it. So now we're going to get, you can't see it on the video recording, but now there is a pop-up saying something bad happened in this alert window. So we could change our code down here to say console log instead of pop-up. And so something bad happened. So that was an error in the endpoint or the API endpoint saying, oh, I don't know what you mean random n with the n. Here's some data about that error. This is actually a more lower level error, right? The fetch tried to talk to a domain that didn't exist. And so it tried to talk to the dogge.ceo and it returned nothing, right? Because there was an error. And so that automatically jumped to this block when something very bad happened. So we know it's working, so we know it's talking to the API correctly, and we know that this error thing will trigger when we have an error. All right, so we have access to this message now. We have access to this JSON response now. And so we just need to do something with it. And so the result is a JSON object. It's a JSON dictionary, and it has a key and a value pair. So it has a key here, it's a message, and it has status, that's the key. So each key has a value. So the key for the message is the URL to the image, and then the key for status is the success message. So when we work with JavaScript, these dictionaries called JavaScript objects, you can actually reference which key you want to talk to. The same idea as how we use 0 to reference a specific item in an array. You can use the key name to reference the piece of data you want to see in that JSON object. So in our case, if we wanted to just print out the message, we just need to reference the message key instead of the whole thing. So we say square brackets message instead of the whole thing. And that will just return that key for that specific JSON object, right? And so instead of printing the whole thing, it just prints the key now on every reload. All right, so we have access to the image URL now, and we can do something with it. So what would we do with it? It's returning a URL to an image. It's not returning the image itself, but it's a URL to the image. So let's create a image of the image URL sent and add it to our page or our content, right? So we have my content here, right? That's the div that we created. So let's make a pointer to it, right? We'll say my content equals document get element by ID, and the ID is my content. All right, and so next thing we're going to say, okay, we have a pointer to that content div now, and so we can create a new element in memory and then add this URL to it and then put it into our page, right? So let's create a new element and we'll make a store pointer to it in a variable called new image. And we'll say, okay, we'll say document create element, right? And so the create element is going to create an element in memory, and we just have to say what type of element. So we're dealing with images here, so let's create an image element. And so now this image element has all of those things associated with an image element that can be done with it. And then the last thing we want to do is add it into our content, right? So we'll say content.append child, and then we'll say new image, and it's going to plop that into the content div. So let's see it works. So if this works, then we should see in our elements, we should see this my content, and then there's this new image tag that's been created, right? All right, so the next thing we need to do is, the image tag obviously doesn't have a source attribute, which would be the URL to the image, right? And so what we need to do is modify the new image actually to have that source element set, and that data is coming from the API with a new URL to the dog image for each time. So if we think back to this, you can use these elements dot set style inner HTML, and there's also this get and set attribute, right? Because if you think about what an image tag source attribute is, it's the URL to the image, but that src tag is an attribute. So in a website, right, this ID is an attribute, and then if we had an image tag with src equals http whatever, right? This is the attribute. src is an attribute of the image tag. So what we can do is basically, okay, we have our image created in memory, or image element created in memory. We can use like set attribute method built into it. And remember, when we use the set attribute, we basically just say, what do we want to set? We want to set the src, and what do we want to set it to, right? So here's where we would put the HTTP URL to the image. But that URL to image is the dog image that's being sent from the API for each time. And so instead of just logging it, like we're doing here, we can just put that in there as the source. And so now it's going to set the attribute and then load that image element into the my content div. So there's a guy with his dog. So if we refresh it, it would do that action over and over again, right? Wow, it's big. So it's a little too big, right? So maybe we can normalize this. So we could say, okay, the new image is being created here. We are setting the attribute there to the URL to the image. And then we could also set the style to make the max width be something like, I don't know, 500 pixels or something like that. So it's going to limit how big it can be. And so it's not going to set them all to that. It's just going to, if any of them are bigger than 500, it would just make sure it's no larger than 500. All right, so that's pretty good. So what we could do, right, is knowing how what we did last week, we created a event listener, right? So what we could do is put all this code inside of an event listener for a click. And so let's add a button to our page here. We're going to say button more Dodge, right? And if you click that button, we'll give it an ID. We'll say more button. And so when you click that button, let's make the API fetch and then add a new thing to the page, right? So we're gonna, first we have to get a pointer to that button. So we'll say var my button equals get elements by ID. And this is the ID. And then we're gonna say, okay, now that I have a pointer to it, we're gonna say add listener. I'm sorry, add event, listen. And when we're gonna listen for a click event. And then when it clicks, we're gonna do this function, right? And so basically we can do is put this entire block of code inside of that event listener function. So I just put it right inside of here. So every time you click the button, this code is ran. So if I click this button, nothing happened. So when you make a mistake, when something happens like this, you go to your console and then you see what error message is telling you, and it's saying uncaught reference error, get element by ID is not defined. So what I would need to do is go back to my code, and it tells you it's happening on line 32. Go back to my code and see what I did wrong, right? And so what I did wrong is I didn't add document.getElement by ID, which is how you have to phrase it. Because getElement by ID is actually a method built into the entire document. So you have to say document first. Document getElement by ID, and then there. So let's click it again and see if it works. Nice. Very nice. All right, so in this example, what we did is we basically are adding new content to a page based on an API response, right? And so the API response is returning just a URL to a random dog image. And so what we are able to do is create these images in memory, change the URL attribute to the right URL we got from the API, and then just point it into our page and add it to the page as a new element from the memory. So this is a good start to kind of understanding how you might react to some data coming back from the API, and the beginnings of how to even work with some data coming back from the API. Let's try to do another example using an API. And so I put this in the slides, but there's a city bike, which is in New York, has a API that basically is a real-time feed of their statuses of their city bike stations. So if you head over to our slides again, there's a link to this API endpoint. And basically this API endpoint is a endpoint that just returns the status of all the stations. And so each station has, as you'd expect, different attributes associated with it, like how many docks are available, how many uh, bikes are disabled in the dock in that station, um, is the station active, uh, all sorts of stuff like that, station ID, etc. Right? So you could potentially use this API to show up, current statuses of certain stations around the city. Um, so you'd also there's other API endpoints that have various other metadata about the different aspects of City Bike. But you could, let's say we wanted to create this like whole dashboard page, right? That takes the current number of bikes and like has the capacity of the current city bike system citywide, right? What capacity is the system at right now? So we need to create an API request that pulls this data in and then does some iteration over this data and some calculations to say like, okay, how many how many bikes are available versus how many docks are there, right? So you would say, add up all the number of bikes available and then divide that by the number of um, um, docks total or something like that, right? So the first thing we need to do is write a script that talks to this API, and then we can do something with the data that comes back with it. So let's make a new project here. We'll make a new glitch. This can just be a simple glitch again. And so with this example, what we're going to do is it's going to be an example working with API data that's a little bit more complicated. The other one was very straightforward, right? There was just two basic key value pairs. And so this time you can see from just the API response, looking at it in our browser, there's a lot more to it than just uh, two keys and the values. So let's start this off. So the first thing we know we need to do is basically uh, talk to this API, right? So the first step would be always like, can we communicate with the API? Do we know how to authenticate if we need to do that? All that sort of stuff. So let's just start off with a script tag, and we'll say, okay, we want to fetch this address. That's the API. And then we want to turn that request into JSON. So we'll say pass that into our JSON method. And then we want to do something with the data ourselves. So we'll pass that into our own function, and that function will do something with the data. And then, of course, we'll have a catch here in case something really goes wrong. We'll function, we'll say, right? So we have our basic layout here defined. URL to the API, then process it as JSON, and then do something with it here, and then we need to pass it into our function, and then do something. So we'll just start off with just console logging and seeing if we actually get the requests working. So let's take a look. Here's our page. Let's look at the console. And here's a console log to it, right? So I made the request, and it says just as object. So this is saying it's an object because it's a JSON object, and it has a lot of kind of nested data structures in it. So the parent object here has a few key value pairs. The first one is a key called data, and the value for that is another object. And so that object has a station key, and then the value for that key is a big array of 1,176 other little objects, which are the representation of each station. So what we need to do is figure out how to basically loop through every single one of these different stations. So the first thing we want to do is actually get to the point where we're at the piece of data that we want to work with, right? So right now we're at this like very high level object level, right? So we know that there is a key below that called data. So let's go back to our code, and we'll say, don't just log the whole thing, just log the piece that's the data part. And we could say data like that, or we could say data like this. It's the same idea. The reason you'd want to have them in these quotes is that if there was like a weird like space in the key name like that, you can't really have a space in the key name when you do this dot notation. But if it's just like a simple one-letter word, you could just use this dot notation. This and this are equivalent. All right, so dot data. All right, so now we're just at the data part, and so we don't even see the data being printed. And then we can say, okay, well, the next key is stations. So let's change that to dot data dot stations. So these are nested things, so they're one after another, right? And so now, instead of printing data dot station or data and then the stations, etc., we just have all the stations being listed here. And so what we can do is try to loop through these things. And so this is something new that we haven't done before. So we know all the data that we want is stored in here. And so instead of console logging it, these arrays, just the way how there's a two lowercase or two uppercase built into strings, these arrays have a thing built into them that lets you loop through them. And so basically you say response.data.station, and then they have a thing built into them called for each. And for each is a method that you just pass it a little function that you want it to do for each one of those iterations, for each one of the items in the array. So you can say function, and then station, and then inside of here is what you would do with the station for each one of them. Right, and station is just my variable I'm calling it. I'm going to call each one of the things in the array is a station, so I'm calling my variable station, but you could call it whatever you want, right? It could just be X. All right, so now that we have it looping through each one of them, inside of these brackets, right, is where we put the code for our function that does something with each one of the stations. So we'll say console.log station. Oh, and it's saying I'm missing a parentheses after something on line 37. So if I went to line 37, I would see it says I'm missing a parentheses. So you have to be careful when you're working with JavaScript that it's very nested, right? There's all these closures inside of each other. You just want to make sure that you're balancing all your opening and ending curly brackets and opening and ending parentheses, right? So I have my function here. There's an open parentheses, close parentheses. There's my curly bracket, open, close, and I have this for each open, closed. So it's saying I'm missing a parentheses somewhere here, and you just want to figure out where it's supposed to go. All right, so basically I spelled function wrong. So if you spell everything right, then it will know what you're talking about and expect the parentheses to be in a certain place. And so basically it didn't know I was trying to write a function, so it was just complaining about that. All right, so now if we reload it, we'd see that it's actually, instead of just printing the data structure, it's actually printing the each individual station for each one, right? And so if I wanted to print out just the number of bikes available, I would say print station or console.log station bikes, num bikes available. Right? And so if we think about this, what we'd want to do is do something about figure out how many bikes are totally available and then how many bikes are supposed to be available for the entire city or system. And so if we go back and look at the data again, let's make this print station again. We see each one has number of bikes available. This one's probably a bad example. Let's find another one. Number of bikes available, number of bikes disabled, and then number of docks available. So you would imagine that the total number of bikes available would be equivalent to number of docks available plus number of bikes available, right? So then because there's only 2 bikes in this one, but there's 22 docks. So 2 of those bikes are represented in the docks. So you could maybe even simplify that and say, okay, number of docks available is 22, um, and number of bikes available is 2, right? So there's 22 empty docks, and then there's 2 docks that are full that have bikes in them. So you would say, okay, so the total number of bikes possible for this station would be 24, right? Because there's actually 22 empty ones and then 2 ones there, so the total number of docks would be 24 docks. Um, Number of bikes disabled, I don't really care about that right now. Number of docks is disabled. Um, could be, it's kind of probably like a rounding error, so it doesn't really matter. Number of e-bikes available. I'm assuming those, you might want to add that to the total too then, right? So uh, the total number of things available plus the number of docks available is the total number of capacity for that station, right? Typically. So this could be totally wrong. I'm assuming, right? I'd have to know more about the city bike um, stations to kind of be sure I was doing that correctly. But say that this is pretty much kind of the general idea. So we basically want to know how many bikes are available for each station total, and then how many bikes could possibly be up there at those stations for all of the stations, right? So let's go back to our code here and try to figure this out. So we could say, okay, so we need a new variable. We could say total bikes equals 0, right? We could say var total possible bikes equals 0. So now that we have these 2 variables defined, we could add to them as we go through our looping of the data, right? So for each station, let's add to the first one, right? So we know total bikes. So we could say um, total bikes equals total bikes, right? Because this could be the 10th iteration or 100th, so we want to make sure we keep track of the previous ones. So total bikes equals total bikes plus, right? And then we'd say station dot um, can't remember what it was. Station dot number of bikes available. Comment that. Right, so now total bikes will add to the total bikes available, and at the end of the loop, right, this code is going to run 1,176 times, and then at the end of it, we can console log it. So at the very end, this is how many total bikes are available right now in the city bike system. 13,000 bikes are available. So the other number we want to figure out is like capacity, like so how many bikes could there possibly be um, available at a station? And then I wonder if those numbers would be the same, right? Because the bikes could potentially not be somewhere else. You're assuming they're not. If they're somewhere else, then they're in a different station. But maybe they're broken or something like that, or just out of the system. So we were thinking, what if we added in um, this total number of docks available plus the total bikes available plus the number of e-bikes available. So if we had that number, then we'd say, like, what's the potential capacity versus what's actually available right now at all the stations. So yeah, I have no idea if this will work. Let's just copy these keys so we don't have to come back here again. Put it here. Put it here as a comment. All right, so the next thing we'd want to do is we want to add up to the other things, right? So we total bikes possible. We're going to say total bikes possible equals total bikes possible plus station dot number of docks available also plus number of bytes available, right? This is like total capacity, station, number of bytes available. And then we're also going to add the e-bytes available too, plus station, number of e-bytes available. So this will be interesting to see total possible bikes versus total bikes. So we can console log both those things by separating them with a comma. Let's see what the numbers are. All right, so this is saying there's 13,000 available right now, but if all the docks were full of bikes, then you would have 34,000 bikes available. We could do kind of quick gut check and just Google how many NYC city bikes are there. So it says there's around 6,000. Oh, it launched with 6,000 bikes. As of 2017, there's 12,000 bikes. So they must have greatly expanded since then. So that was almost 4 years ago. So who knows? This is theoretical, right? So say this is true, and there actually is a potential capacity of 34,000 if there was a bike in every dock in every station around the city. But in reality, there's only 13,000 of them at each dock. I guess this makes sense, right? Because like the bikes would travel from one to the other. Not every station's full, so this might not be the best kind of comparison. But you can kind of think about, on average, an average station, what percentage of it is actually full of bikes. All right, so now that we have these two numbers, we could say, okay, let's do a little bit of our math here. We'll say total percentage, or we'll say average percentage of available. And we'll say that's going to be equal to the total bikes currently divided by the total bikes possible, and then we're going to multiply that by 100 to make a percentage sign. And so we'll console log that average percent of available. So let's see what it says. So around 38% capacity, theoretical capacity. So if you went to, on average, each station has about 38% of its bikes available. Again, this is kind of, we have to know more about the system to say these are good numbers or not, but it's a good start. All right, so now that we have this number, we want to transform this from not just console logging into the console. Let's actually do something with it, right? Let's put it into an HTML element and display it, right? So, of course, you could just do maybe like for a dashboard, you could do something like a big number, right? So we could just do that. So let's make a little H1 here, and we'll say average bike availability, and it should look something like 50% or something like that, right? So our task would be to change this from always saying 50 to be whatever the result of our calculation was there. So let's give this a ID. We'll give it status H1 or something like that. And down here, instead of logging it, we'll say we'll say var status text equals document get element by ID. That's that. And we'll say status text. And so now we're changing the text inside of the element. So that's we can just do that with inner HTML equals, and we want to say something like average bike availability 50%, but we don't want that 50% part, and we want to add in our own number there, and then we got to add in the percentage sign again at the end here. So it's like the text average number percentage, then the number, and then the percentage sign at the end of it. All right, let's see how it looks. Very official, right? With this very long, very accurate number of decimal points. And so what we could do is we could say we wanted to round that number to just the whole number, so say 38%. We can actually do that by saying parse int. And parse int is just a function that's built into JavaScript that turns whatever you pass into it into an integer. So right now it's like a decimal, it's a floating point number. We want to turn it into an integer. And so now it turned into an integer. Let's get rid of that 50% and put question marks there. All right, so another thing we could do, right, if we would do something like maybe have a percentage bar, right? I know that's something built into HTML. So let's look at this, the progress bar on the content Microsoft Developers Network, or Mozilla Developers Network, I'm sorry. So here we have like a progress bar, and it basically is its own element, and it has an ID, then it has the max total, and then it has the value. So to get 70%, they just change the value to 70 here, and then you have this progress bar here. So let's make our own progress bar. So we could have two different ways of doing this. We could create a progress bar from scratch, or we could have it defined and then just alter the properties, right? We probably want to have it defined and just alter the properties because we don't need to create it each time. Unlike the dog demonstration where we're creating a new element each time because we wanted to have the previous ones there, we're only ever going to have one progress bar, so we'll just edit the current one instead of creating a new one each time. So we're going to have the progress bar there. Let's change the ID to status bar. And then we have the max value, and then the max is 100, and the value is, we'll set it to 0 first. And we'll get rid of this. So we need to change this value attribute, and we want to add the percentage inside of the text value. So the first thing, of course, is we gotta do the same thing where we get a pointer to the element. So we'll say status bar equals document get element by ID, and then the ID is called status bar. So now we have a link to it. We can say change the things that we want to change about it, right? So the first thing we want to change is similar as we want to set the inner HTML to the percentage and the sign. So let's reuse that code that we have already done. And then the next thing we want to do is set the, right, there's two pieces to it. There's the max possible percentage, which is 100, and then the value is set to the what it's currently at. So we would say, okay, let's do the status bar set attribute. And what do we want to set? We want to set the value. And what do we want to set it to? we want to set it to this whole number, or we could use the decimal number, it doesn't matter. And then set that value to 38 or whatever it is at the time. So let's see if it works. That looks like 38%, right? Let's inspect it. Yeah, there's our decimal number, 38. Right, and then you could style this to however you want it to look, make it bigger, etc. But that's kind of like a good jumping off point. So you might want to add something so it refreshes this every once in a while or something like that. But and of course make sure that these numbers are make sense. But yeah, that's a good start for working with JavaScript. And so for most of the things, you do the same kind of idea where you would do something with the data or make API requests for the data, and then do something with your HTML, creating elements, modifying existing elements, etc. So the challenge for this week would be to work on maybe adding one of these to your class project, New York Times, IMDb, etc. page, to use an API to do some sort of content loading and then creating the content on the page without having to refresh the page using that API request. So you can give that a try now, and then we're going to go over it together to see how you would do that for each page. All right, so if we want to add these API capabilities to our class projects, that's the New York Times site, the IMDb, and the museum site, we would have to know the API endpoints available to be used on these sites. And so these sites are, these are kind of custom sites just for this class. And so there are not a lot of API endpoints for these sites, but there is at least one for each of them that I'll go through for each one and document and how you would use it. And then you can apply it. We'll go through it, adding it to our own site. So for the first one up is the New York Times site. And so basically each New York Times site has a couple endpoints available to it. One of them is for related subjects, one is for related creators. And so the related subject ones would return related subject books that have related subjects. So this book has the subject heroes. So if you wanted to get other books that had the subject heroes, you could do that. And then related creator, which returns books by the same author. So you can imagine that this might be a useful feature if you were on the page and you said, okay, I want to click on heroes or something like that, and I want to see more books that have that same subject. So the way that the API works is that if you go to, for this site, for the NYT site, if you go to /related subjects, one word, and then you go to um, / the subject name that you want to search for. So for example, for this one, it's, if you wanted to find more subjects about heroes or schools, you'd say / related subjects, and then / schools, and it would return JSON with resources, books that had the word schools in them for a subject heading. All right, so I will make that a little bit clearer as we go through and do this for the New York Times site. So let's just do it for the home page for the New York Times site. I'm going to remix this into a new one. So I'm starting off with a fresh New York Times installation here. And so you have to think about like what's going to trigger this activity, right? So maybe there might be like a button after each subject page, right? That might have like show more of the subject or something like that. So that could be a good way of triggering this API. All right, so this is the home page. It's only set to display one of them, and it has all these subjects, right? So let's modify this, just the home page, just as an example, so that there'll be a button after each one of these subjects that says click here for more or something like that, and it will demonstrate talking to the API and then doing something with the results, right? All right, so we're going to edit the home page, so that's the index page, and then we have our subjects here. So the first thing we need to do is have some sort of trigger for each one of these subjects. And if we think about passing data around, we have to think about, how are we going to send this, what we're looking for to the API so that the fetch method can go off and fetch the right API endpoint. So let's start with something easy, right? Let's start with just adding the button, right? So you'll probably want to spend much more time working on this to make it look better for your site, right? But we're just going to do something very rough and ready. So we'll say, okay, see more. And so now there should be a button for each subject, right? So what we want the functionality to be is you click on the see more button and you get shown some more things, right? All right, so if we think about this first step is, okay, we need to add an event listener so that when I click on this thing, it does something, right? So we're into a new situation where we don't just have one trigger, we have possibly a bunch of triggers here. So let's add some identifying characteristic to this button so we can work with it, right? So we'll add a class to it. So we'll call this see more subject button. All right, so now each one of these has a button, and we can reference it at least somehow. It's differentiated from all the other buttons on the page, right? So what we need to do is select all the buttons and add an event listener to them. So there is a way to do that. Get element by class name. And so we're familiar with get element by ID, get element by tag name, etc. So there's get elements by class name, and we can see them an example of it. And so see, notice this is elements. So like the previous, when we were looking at get elements by tag name, it returns an array of them, right? So there's many of them. So you'd have to make sure you're referencing the right one, and in our case, we want to reference all of them. So let's try to add an event listener to all of the buttons, so at least we can get some event triggering happening. All right, so we're going to go back to our code here, and we're just going to put this at the bottom of the site. We're going to say, okay, I'm going to say see more buttons. I'm going to say document.get element by class name, get elements by class name. Right, and the class name we want to search for is the see more subject button. All right, so let's console log that to see if make sure we got what we think we were going to get. All right, so let's look at the console. So there's one subject. Oh, there's no subjects here, so we probably want to hide it when there's no subjects, but here's one with more subjects. And so each one of these is one of the buttons here. All right, so we know we can add it to the first one by saying 0 here, but we want to add it to all of the collection of buttons, all the buttons in this results. So there's a lot of ways of looping through data in JavaScript, and to loop through these collections of HTML elements, there's a for loop specifically designed to do that, to loop through it and other stuff. And so we're going to use that for loop to loop through this kind of array of these buttons that we search for. And to do that, we're going to say for, and then you have to give it two variables here. You have to give it what do you want to call the thing in each loop, the piece of the array you're working on, and then what is the big collection of things called in general. And you say, okay, for in each iteration, I'm looping through a button, right? Because it's a collection of buttons, so I'll call it buttons. This could also be called B, but we'll call it buttons. It's a variable. And you say of, and then the thing, the collection of elements you're looping through, which is see more buttons. So for each of these see more buttons, store it into this variable called button on each loop, and this loop will run however many buttons there are that I found, right? So let's see if this works. We'll console log button. So hopefully we'll see each one of those buttons for each loop. All right, so this one has 3 subjects. So we look at the console, we see 3 buttons. So inside of this loop, each time it's looping button, that variable button represents one of those buttons that we search for and returned as a collection of them. So what we can do then is, instead of adding it to the first one, we could add the event listener to all of the or to each one of them as we loop through them, right? So now we don't have to specify just that very first one or any of them. We can just say the variable button. And so now for each iteration, button is going to be the first one, then it's going to be the second one, then it's going to be the third one, etc., until all of them have been looped through. And so using this for of loop, we can add stuff like that. All right, so each one, there's 2 of them here, so I should be able to click on both of these, and they both do something. They both have the event listeners connected to them. Now, the next problem is, right, we need to have access to the value of the subject right here. This is motivation, happiness, etc. Instead of having, we know it was clicked on, but we need to know that word so we can send it off to the API to return back the results, right? So we need that data somehow, that access to that piece of data. And so what is nice is that this event variable that's passed into this event listener, if you console log that, it has information about the event itself. And one of the pieces of information about it is the target of what was clicked. So the event has a registry of its parent, of who clicked it, and what its parent is, and its name, and all that sort of stuff. All those associated values associated with an element. So you can actually log that by saying events.target. And so this is the target of the event. This is the button that was clicked on. So let's get one that has subjects. So if I click on this, it returns that this is the button specifically that was clicked on right now, right? And I have access to that inside of the loop. So now I need to do something about this, basically being able to get, when I click on this button, I want it to console log Crawford Best, or I want to click console log England, right? So I know which button it was pressed on and which value I need to send off to the API. So there's a couple of ways of doing this, but what we can do is, since we have access to the HTML, we can actually store the value in the button itself. We could do it a couple ways, but we could say value equals, and inside these parentheses or quotation marks, we could put the subject value. So let's look at that, how it looks in the HTML. So here's a subject called mothers, and if we inspect the button now there is a attribute called value that has mothers as the value. So what you could do, right, if you have access to the target, which is the button, you have access to the things like get attribute, set attribute, style, etc., right? And so you could say, okay, let's, instead of logging the target, just the target, let's log the target, which is the button, and let's log its get attribute, and let's log its value attribute. Let's see if this works. So when I click on this button, ability, I should see ability, right? See on this one, inheritance succession. And so you can kind of see that we're passing data into our click event via the element itself, right? The value that it is stored in the button itself, in its element attribute called value. and then it's passed on to the JavaScript thing by accessing what it is. Another way of doing it is that there is a data element, or data attribute, I'm sorry, that is in HTML. And so you can use data attributes for storing arbitrary data in the HTML structure. And HTML has very specific rules about what elements can have attributes and what elements can't have attributes. So there might be a rule saying that buttons shouldn't have a value attribute. Or say you're doing this with a div. Divs definitely shouldn't have a value attribute. That just is not part of the standard. But there are these things called data attributes that you can store and access the various pieces of arbitrary data stored in them. And so what you can do is you can set this data attribute in the element itself by saying data hyphen and then the attribute name. So for us, we could change this to be a little bit more standardized by saying data hyphen and then the name of the data, we'll call it subject. So now we are using a data attribute to store, in the data attribute called subject, store the subject itself. And then you can actually access it in JavaScript by saying, okay, the element, then data set, and then the name of the data property you set. So in our case, it was subject. So we can change it over to use this subject, data subject, by switching it from value to saying, okay, the target, which is the button, dot dataset dot subject, right? So now if we see one with some buttons, we should be able to click on this, and it's passing that piece of data through the data property of the button into our JavaScript function, and then we're accessing it, right? Because in each one of these clicks, the event.target represents the button itself, because the button is the target of the event, so we can access it. So this is kind of like a way that you have to do to get around the idea that you want to pass data into your event listener and your click listener, but you don't know which thing was clicked, right? And so this event.target stores what was clicked, and then it has these things built into it like the data properties that you can pass data around. So it's super useful to pass data into your JavaScript this way. All right, so now I can click on each one of these and it works, right? It console logs its specific its specific subject for that one. So what we want to do is now add something more complex logic to it, right? We don't just want to console log the name of the subject. We want to do something with it, right? So let's store that into a new variable. We'll say subject equals this. So now we have this subject stored in this just a shorthand variable there. And so now we can go back and do what we originally want to do, is talk to the API. And so the API is starts off with fetch, right? We're going to fetch something. And inside here is the URL. And so in the previous examples, we had these full long URLs because they're actually talking to web servers that were not our computer, right? They weren't our server. They were someone else's server on the internet. But since the API is built into its own website, we can use relative paths to it. And so the relative path is related subject, one word, like that. And related subject would be the equivalent if you did this, if you were looking at the production version of the site, it would be like this, right? The full URL would look like that, the full URL with a domain name and everything. But since it's relative path, we can just say, okay, from the home, go to related subject, and then that's what we want. And the only other thing we need to do is that, if you were looking for heroes, this would be the URL for the API to return the heroes related subjects. So we just need to add in that last piece, the subject piece, to it. So it builds up that URL. All right, so then this part's familiar. We're going to say then. We're going to turn the response into JSON, pass that on to the next piece, which is then going to pass it into our own function, which will have the response available to us. And then we can do whatever we want in there, and then we'll catch it if there's like a big error. We'll log error. All right, so if our first step will be just to see if this works, right? And we'll console log the response to see if it is what we get back from the response. All right, so we immediately have an error here. It says unexpected token on line 128. So basically it got to the end of the script and something was not balanced. The curly brackets were not balanced and it says something bad happened here. It didn't work. So we need to go back in here and just double check everything is closed. And so I didn't add a closing parentheses, right? Because up here we have opening parentheses. There's a closed parentheses. And then I need to have I messed this up here. Okay, so I just need to correct this so it is actually all wrapped inside of this catch, right? Before I didn't have this, the function wrapped around the catch, right? All right, so we won't get a console error for this now. So if you go back here, it loads okay, so all the syntax is okay. So then when we have a subject here and we click on werewolves, it's actually making that fetch request and it's going out and returning more things about werewolves, right? So if we look at the network tab, when we actually click on these things, let's make it smaller. So when we actually click on these things, like the fairies tab, it makes that request, right? It's making these requests in real time. And so here's the URL it's making the request to. And then it's showing us the response too. So in our application, we have now, it's returning this data, which is, at this point, you can probably tell it's a array of these objects, right? Very similar to the example when we looked at City Bike. So now it has all the stuff that we would expect to have for each piece of the data for each book and stored as a JSON structure. And so then our next thing would be like, well, can we loop through each one of these things ourselves? So let's try looping through this. So in this case, we can use the for each loop. We can say function book, right? At this point, each one of these is a book. We could console log the book. So if we have one that has subjects, click on weight loss, and so here's each one of those books. And so at this point, you have to think about like what the desired interface you want it to be for this being successful, right? So you would think about where do these similar or kind of similar books show up in the page, and you maybe would want to have them show up on each right underneath them, or maybe in like a sidebar at the bottom or something like that. But you'd have to work on that and figure that out. But let's just simply add a new div on here underneath the subjects called we'll call it an ID of related books. And you have all access to this information about each book, so you could potentially display the covers of each book, or you could do all sorts of stuff to it, right? So let's just print out the titles for each one of them. And so now that we have the each book, we have a place to put it, let's get a pointer to the place to put it. We'll say var related books div, and that's going to be document get an element by ID. This is our ID. And we could now add a new element, create a new element. So we'll create let's create a link, right? An a link which will be a link to the book. So we'll say, okay, var a link equals documents dot create element, and it's going to be a link. All right, so now if we think about what goes into an a link, there's got to be a title, or what goes in between the two a links. So we'll say inner HTML, and that's going to be one of our, it's going to be the title probably, right? So we know that the title is stored in a variable called title. So we just say book.title, hopefully. And then the other thing that goes along with the a link is the link to where it goes, right? And so that's in the attribute, that's in the href attribute. So we could say a link dot set attribute. We want to set the href, and we want to set it to. And we think about how this works, right? To get to a link to the page, we need to go to /book/ this ISBN number for our system. So the link should go to /book/ and then we need to add in the ISBN number. So we'll say book.isbn because that's where it's stored. All right, so now we have this a link. Let's just console log it to see if it's what we expect to see without adding to the page yet. So let's find one that has subjects. All right, murder. So here is creating a link, and here's the title. So in memory, it looks good, looks great. Let's just add it to our div, right? The last step would be to say related book div dot append child that add the a link. So if we go to journalists, click on this, we should see, oh, we ran into an error. All right, so the error is not very useful into telling us what is the error. So you could add, I think you can add more specifics to this error thing to see, because this catch is caching errors that happen within this function too. So it might be that there's a typo or something like that and it caught it. So let's see if we can add, if we add that error, pass that error to it, if we get any more information about it. All right, so we get the error by saying related book div is not defined. All right, so we go back here, related book div, and it's because I spelled it wrong without an S, right? So let's try it again. All right, so if we click on this, we should see a bunch of things added for America. Let's try another one, Taoism. It adds a bunch of these links, and they're actually links that did work, right? It went to that specific book, Alcoholics. And so you can see the problem is, right, now you get into this infinite thing where it's like, well, I want to make the display look a little bit better. But another thing is, if you click on this again, right, it's just adding them to the ends, right? It's just adding them to the end of the last one that was added. So we have two problems. It looks terrible, but that's, that's a long problem to fix. And the second thing is we want to clear out what's there before we add the new stuff. But you could set the inner HTML to be nothing. And so it would just empty it all out before you add more stuff into it again. So that's probably the easiest way of doing this. So we'll try it again. Let's try one that has different subjects. All right. So here we're going to click on school integrations, and there is one. I'm going to click on civil rights. And so you can see it's clearing them out when we click on them. Let's try another one. United States, families, transgender youth, gender nonconformity. So it's clear it's clearing them out before it adds another one. The other thing was just that it looks terrible, and that's not really much we can do about that now because I don't want to spend a lot of time doing it. But we can just set the style um, of the A link, at least to be block instead of inline. So at least it is a list instead of a. All right, so that was for the New York Times site. The other sites that we can look at really quickly are the IMDb database site. And so the IMDb database site has similar API endpoints available. One is related keyword. So if there's like a plot keyword you want to search for, one is related genres, so very similar to the subject, and then one is related director. So if you wanted to get more results back from the same director, and then also one is search. So if you wanted your search results as JSON, you can do that too. So for example, if you're going to do the related director, it's pretty much identical to what we just did. So on this page where you have data for like James Cameron, for example, you'd have a button there or some other event that would pass James Cameron into that function and then do that API search where it would be slash related director slash James Cameron or the variable or whatever you're passing into it. So it would look almost identical to this, the code we just did for New York Times. So you could just repurpose that, but use it for the different endpoint to play around with. The other projects are the museum site. And so the museum site, let's go take a look at that, is slightly different because it doesn't have these sort of genre or subject-based kind of related tags, but it does have an endpoint, and the endpoint is designed to basically return a search result as JSON. So this is meant for the map page. So as you're developing the map page, you can type in searches and it will kind of real-time update the map page with those search results. And so we have at the bottom here, we have a search where you can change the format to JSON and it will return the search result as JSON itself. So for example, if you're on the search page, if you're on the search page and you searched for Cleveland, if you change the URL, you just add the parameter format equals JSON, it will return the results back as a JSON result. And so it will return the result back as a list of JSON objects that you can loop through and do stuff with. So we could quickly kind of demonstrate that maybe by adding a, so we haven't learned how to do anything with the maps yet with the map widgets or something like that, but we could kind of get that ready by going over to it. So I'm going to remix this glitch. And what we could do is maybe when you're on the map page, as you're typing, it would be doing new searches to the backend and in real time updating the map, for example. That would be like one example. So we have this map page, right? And so it looks like this. So it already kind of has like a start of the map. But what you could do is maybe add a search button here. So when they're on the map page, you could start searching for something like filter by a name, for example, and show those results. So we would need to make a place to type and then make a event listener to listen for the changing in typing, and then do some sort of query to the backend to search for that result. So if we go in here and let's add a new input box. type is going to be text. Yeah, and that should be it. There should be a text box here, right? All right, so the thing is when we type in here, we want it to do something and kick off a search. So we need to give this guy a name, an ID, so we'll say search text. And then let's go down here into our script, and we'll make a new script. There's a script in there already for the map stuff that we haven't gotten to yet, but we'll go in here and make a new script. And so let's get a pointer to that input box. So we'll say search text or search box equals document get element by ID, and then that's the text box. And now let's add a event listener. And so there's lots of event listeners, right? So we're going to say add event listen. And so you could do something like key down, right? But I believe there's one called change. So when there's a change event to the value of the element, it will trigger this event. And so when that happens, send it off to this results. And let's just try this, test it. And so as we looked in the last, if you watched the New York Times one, event has a target, and for all input boxes, there is a value property. So you can actually get the value of the target, which is the input box itself, and we could hopefully, when you type something, it should console log that value now. So let's take a look here. All right, so this is not related to us, some other stuff. So when we type here, test, nothing happens. All right, so maybe change is not the right. So let's double check and change this to key press and see if we can kick off the. All right, so that works. But you see, every type, every kind of single key press though would trigger the function, which I don't necessarily want. I saw something. Let's go back to change. Okay, so when the element loses focus, it triggers the change event. So it's like if I was typing here and I tabbed over to the next one, then it would change. So that's not necessarily what we wanted to do. All right, we don't want you to have to leave the input box for it to change. So I'm going to say element or event listener on text box change. See if there's a better one to use. These are also good for like select buttons, right? Like when you change this is changing it. But it might not be. Yeah, so that's the same behavior for they're demonstrating. All right, so for now, you might want to spend some time on this and figure out what would be a better one, but we'll just go with key press for now. Save time. So every time there's a key press, we saw that it's working, and we saw that it is whatever we type into the input box is now available to us, right? So the next thing would be to initiate a search based on that value that you typed into it, right? And so what we can do is inside of here, we can do our fetch, and the URL is relative again, right? And so what I'm going to do is just go back to the search page and get a example. So for Cleveland, for example. And so this is the URL. I'm just going to copy everything after the base of the URL and go back to where we were. And in our code, this was the base of the URL. And so you say search order by, search value, and then you add the format equals JSON. And that's just the way that this API, I've made this API. So we need to slot in, instead of for the keyword here, we need to slot in our own keyword. So we can just, at the very end, add in our thing that we've been console logging, right? All right, so now it's gonna build that URL with a search thing we want to search for, and then we're going to parse it into JSON, and then we're going to pass it into our own function where we do something with it. And then we would probably add a catch there if we wanted to. All right, so let's just console log the response and see if it's working. So as we type, we should be able to say, so I typed Cleveland and it returned the two things that had the word Cleveland in the result, right? And so these are huge pieces of data for each one of them. So we haven't gotten to this part yet, so we can't go much further than this, but we can see that the API part of it's working. And so what you could do, for example, is, as soon as they type in something, you could clear the markers from the map and then add in the new markers for that search result, right? And so that would be kind of like the next step for this one. But okay, so we went through all three of the class projects and kind of documented the APIs that you could be using and how you might apply them. The New York Times and the IMDb are very similar as far as the APIs available and how you might implement them. And then this museum map site is a little bit different, but hopefully you get the idea. So using that knowledge of how the APIs for these class project site works, you should be able to get started and then start building your own kind of interface changes based on API responses and stuff like that. So I think that is an end for this lecture. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you later. Bye.